The auctioneer's gavel fell with a crack, and Elizabeth Thompson became the owner of 43 acres of wooded hillside that no one else wanted to touch. Lot 22, the Whitaker place, creek, forest, and a cave the size of a barn right in the middle. The crowd chuckled. Everyone knew this land. Old John Whitaker had tried for 15 years before giving up. The cave made normal farming impossible. Too much stone, too little soil, that dark mouth breathing cold across the pasture. Elizabeth had studied the property twice. She stood under the cave's overhang and felt how the temperature stayed stable while February bit at her hands. She saw what John Whitaker had never imagined, a roof she wouldn't have to build. When the bidding stopped at $48, Elizabeth raised her hand. She counted out nearly everything from the sale of her house, the house she couldn't maintain alone after William's death. Whispers followed her. The widow's gone mad. That cave will ruin her and those children. Elizabeth lifted her daughters from the wagon. Emily, 10 years old, watchful. Little Sophie, barely 3, who still asked about father before bed. They had 2 trunks, a cooking stove, and a plan so fragile Elizabeth barely dared think about it directly. They reached the property at sunset. The cave seemed larger than in memory, its overhang stretching 40 feet across, cutting into the hillside like a wave frozen in stone. The creek ran fast and clear 20 yards from the cave entrance, and beyond it dark pines climbed toward the ridge. "Mama, I'm scared," whispered Emily. Elizabeth was scared too, but she'd learned that fear and moving forward could coexist. "Help me with the tarp," she said instead. "We'll make camp tonight." She had planned this, planned with the desperation that sharpens thinking rather than clouds it. The cave floor was uneven but dry, scattered with old leaves and remnants of John Whitaker's debris. Working by lantern light, she and Emily swept a corner, laid oilcloth, spread blankets. The cooking stove went right at the cave entrance where smoke could escape. Elizabeth built the first small fire, boiled water from the creek, made porridge from the cornmeal she'd packed. Sophie fell asleep halfway through. Emily ate silently, then asked, "What are we building, Mama?" "A life," said Elizabeth. "But first a sheep pen." Emily's expression, confusion wrestling with trust, almost broke her. But Elizabeth had done the calculations. She had $27 left. Lumber, even for a small barn, would take most of it. But she had a cave with a stone roof that would never leak, walls on 3 sides that would never rot, and space enough for 30 sheep to winter safely. If she could buy sheep, if she could make them thrive, if she could spin their wool and sell it before the money ran out. If. She fell asleep with her daughters pressed against her, the cave breathing its steady cold breath, and stars she couldn't see wheeling overhead. Work began before true dawn. Elizabeth woke to Sophie's whimpering and Emily's patient attempts to soothe her. In the thin light, the cave looked like a mouth ready to swallow them. Elizabeth pushed the thought away and built up the fire. She'd brought axes, brought a handsaw. Most important, she'd brought knowledge. Her father had been a carpenter before becoming a farmer, and he'd taught her to see how wood wants to join, how weight distributes, how a joint should lock. The sheep pen came first, because it had to. She scoured the property for fallen timber, finding oak and ash from some ancient storm. She cut rails, split stakes, drove them deep into the cave floor where stone gave way to packed earth. Emily helped, her small hands learning to hold steady while Elizabeth swung the mallet. The pen took shape slowly, a solid barrier that would hold sheep, protect lambs from the draft at the entrance, create sections for separating animals. Elizabeth built hay racks from stripped saplings, assembled them with patience born from having no money for mistakes. "Why here?" Emily asked on the 3rd day, while Elizabeth set corner posts. "Why in the cave?" Elizabeth paused, wiping sweat despite the cold. "Feel it here. Not warm, but not freezing either. The cave holds the earth's heat. Snow can pile 6 feet outside, but here the sheep will stay dry. They'll birth lambs here, and the lambs won't freeze." Emily's eyes widened. "We'll have lambs. We'll try." The cabin came next. She chose a spot by the creek, but high enough to avoid spring flooding. The foundation was creek stones, hauled one by one and fitted into place. Emily proved surprisingly good at choosing stones that nestled together. Elizabeth felled dead or dying trees, sectioned them, stripped bark, notched the ends with an axe that grew heavier each day. The cabin grew, 1 log at a time. She chinked gaps with moss and clay from the creek bank. The roof was roughly cut cedar shakes, laid in overlapping rows. The fireplace took 5 days. The stones had to fit precisely. The chimney had to draw. When she lit the first fire and smoke rose cleanly through the chimney, Emily clapped. They moved in on a Sunday, 12 feet by 14 feet. 2 sleeping platforms, shelves, a table from split logs. The windows were oiled paper, but they let in light and kept out wind. "This is ours," said Emily, touching the wall with something like wonder. "It is," Elizabeth agreed. Then quieter. "Now we need sheep." She walked to the village on Monday, leaving Emily in charge with strict instructions. October cold had settled deep, but the path along the creek was becoming familiar. 3 miles to the main road, 2 more into the village, past houses where lamplight glowed yellow and the smell of roasting meat made her stomach clench. She found Robert Hayes at his farm just south of the village. She'd learned he raised sheep and occasionally sold his breeding stock. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, surprise plain on his weathered face. "I heard you bought that Whitaker place. People talk." He paused, perhaps remembering courtesy. "People say I'm foolish," Elizabeth finished. "They might be right. But I need ewes, Mr. Hayes, young ones, bred for fall lambs. How many can I buy for $20? His eyebrows rose. $20 all you have? $20 all I can spend on sheep. He studied her long. "You planning to winter them in that cave?" "I am. John Whitaker couldn't make that land work. John Whitaker tried to farm against the cave. I plan to farm with it." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite respect, but willingness to be convinced. "I've got 6 I could sell. All bred. Should drop lambs in March or April. $20 for all 6. But I'm only doing this because I'm curious if you'll make it work." "I'll make it work. You'll need a ram eventually. One thing at a time, Mr. Hayes." She walked back to the property with the ewes following on tethers, their bells chiming softly in the cold air. It took all afternoon. By the time they reached the creek, true dark was falling, but she could see Emily had built a fire outside. Her daughter stood waiting, eyes wide at the sight of the animals. "6 sheep," breathed Emily. "6 sheep," confirmed Elizabeth. "And they're counting on us." She led them into the cave, into the pen she'd built. The ewes explored their new space, nosing at the hay she'd managed to cut and cure from the narrow meadow upstream. The cavern stillness seemed to settle them. By full dark, they were lying down, chewing cud, their presence making the cavern feel occupied rather than empty. Elizabeth sat on a stump outside, watching smoke rise from both the cavern mouth and the cabin chimney. $27 reduced to 7, everything riding on 6 pregnant sheep and her ability to make something no one else had seen. Emily came and sat beside her. "Mama, what if they're right, the people in village?" "Then we'll know we tried our best," said Elizabeth. But she was thinking, they won't be right. I won't let them be. November brought snow. 3 feet in one storm, then another foot the following week. The valley transformed into something from a winter tale. Every branch waded white, the brook running dark between ice-rimmed banks, the cavern mouth breathing out warmer air that formed clouds in the frigid morning. Elizabeth worked through it all. The bridge across the brook had to be built. She couldn't risk wet crossings all winter. She felled 2 pines, stripped them, laid them across the narrowest point she could find. Emily helped drag smaller logs for decking, and together they lashed everything with rope Elizabeth had hoarded from the house sale. The bridge held. Elizabeth tested it first, then crossed with both girls, their feet echoing hollow on the wood. From the other side, she could see the whole property. Cabin tucked against the hill, smoke rising, the cavern dark and vast beyond. Sheep occasionally visible inside. "It looks like a real place," said Emily. Elizabeth understood. It looked like somewhere people were meant to be. But that was also when the isolation truly settled in. In village, people had whispered. Out here, there was no one to whisper. The snow erased any path to neighbors. Not that she had neighbors. The nearest was the Fletchers, 3 miles north, and they'd made clear they thought Elizabeth's venture was doomed. The sheep became her calendar. She checked them twice daily, learning their habits, their personalities. The brown ewe was bossy. The smallest one, Elizabeth started calling her darling, always wanted scratching behind her ears. Elizabeth studied their bodies, watching for signs of lambing, reading books she'd borrowed from the village library before leaving. Emily learned with her. They sat in the cavern while Sophie napped in the cabin, their breath frosting as they watched the sheep, and Elizabeth explained what to look for. The utter filling, the you seeking isolation, the restlessness before labor. Will they all survive? Asked Emily. Some might not, said Elizabeth honestly. But we'll do everything we can. The first lamb came on a March morning when ice coated every surface. Elizabeth woke to Emily shaking her shoulder. Mama, the brown one is acting strange. They hurried to the cavern, lantern swinging. The brown ewe was circling, pawing the ground, clearly uncomfortable. Elizabeth had prepared for this. She'd read about it, planned for it, but knowledge and experience were different territories. She sent Emily to boil water while she examined the ewe. The lamb was coming front feet first. Good, but the ewe was struggling. Elizabeth waited, patient, stepping in only when the labor stalled. When she finally pulled the lamb clear, wet and steaming in the cold cavern air, it didn't move. No, whispered Emily. Elizabeth rubbed the lamb with hay, clearing its nose and mouth. She rubbed harder, faster, and suddenly it gasped, coughed, tried to stand on wobbling legs. The ewe turned, and Elizabeth had to back away fast as the mother's instinct kicked in. She watched the ewe lick her lamb clean, watched the lamb find its feet, watched it nurse for the first time. We did it, said Emily, tears on her cheeks. She did it, corrected Elizabeth. But she felt it, too. The fragile, fierce hope. 11 more lambs came over the next 6 weeks. 10 survived. Elizabeth and Emily learned through trial and error how to help without interfering, when to step in, how to warm a weak lamb by the cabin fire and return it to its mother. The cavern filled with bleeding, and even Sophie learned to help, fetching clean rags and sitting very still to watch the babies. By May, the flock had grown to 16, and Elizabeth had a new problem. She needed income. The water wheel was madness, but logic pushed her forward. Wool needed carting. The brook ran year-round with steady power. A water wheel could drive a carting machine, maybe even a small grindstone. The Fletchers rode 6 miles to mill their grain. If Elizabeth could grind locally, she could charge for the service. She studied the brook for days, finding a natural spot where water dropped 3 feet over a limestone shelf, perfect for power. The wheel required lumber she couldn't afford, so she salvaged planks from Whitaker's abandoned farmhouse. She carved a shaft from oak. She traded her last good dress for iron bearings from a salvaged wagon. The construction took all of June. She built the frame, mounted the axle, attached paddles. Each paddle had to be angled correctly, secured with wooden pegs and rope. She fell into the brook twice. The first test failed. The wheel turned backward. Elizabeth cursed and redesigned the paddle angle. The second test was better. By the third, it was working. The wheel spun steadily, and when she engaged the simple drive belt to a carting drum, it turned. Emily whooped, and Elizabeth felt something she hadn't felt since William died. Wild, fierce joy. Word reached the village by August. Mrs. Edwards stopped her outside the general store. I hear you've built some kind of contraption, a water wheel for carting wool and grinding grain. What Elizabeth didn't know was that the Edwards owned shares in the mill 6 miles south, or that a woman running her own operation challenged more than economics. Mr. Edwards refused her credit. Can't extend credit to someone on bad land with children to support. The blacksmith wouldn't sell her nails. The carpenter wouldn't part with lumber. Even the church ladies began talking about poor decisions and those motherless children. Still, the work continued. Elizabeth sheared her sheep, washed fleece in the brook, carded it, and spun by firelight. By October, she had yarn to sell. Mrs. Collins examined it and nodded. Good work. $8. $8 for 3 months of work. But it was more than she'd had. Walking home, she ran into Robert Hayes. He'd heard about her water wheel. Is it true you're grinding grain? Small batches. I haven't worked out rates. The mill charges a tenth. Could you do better? 1/12. Same-day service. He studied her. You're either very clever or very desperate. Probably both. He laughed. I'll send my son with 20 bushels tomorrow. The wheel did well. Word spread slowly. A few farmers tried Elizabeth's service. She charged less, worked harder, and built a small customer base. But she'd made an enemy. Edward Mills owned the Eastern Mill and sat on the village council. When Elizabeth's operation cut into his profits, he spread rumors. The water wheel was dangerous, the cavern unhealthy, those children being raised wild. Then came sabotage. Someone damaged her sluice gate. She fixed it in 2 days. A week later, someone left her sheep pen open. She found 3 ewes wandering near the road. Emily found a note. Go back to village where you belong. Elizabeth pulled it down. That night, she acknowledged the fear. She was alone out here. But leaving would mean admitting defeat. And she had nowhere to go. Her money was in this land. These sheep that wheel. She decided to stay, to be more careful, to protect what she'd built. Then came the blizzard. It hit in early November with a fury that turned the world white. Elizabeth had been watching the sky, reading the signs, the clouds piling up north, the strange stillness in the air, the way the sheep pressed close together even before the first flakes fell. Stay inside, she told the girls. Don't go out for anything. The snow began mid-morning and didn't stop for 3 days. It fell so thick Elizabeth couldn't see the cavern from the cabin. The wind screamed around their walls, finding every gap in the chinking, every weakness in the construction. Snow piled against the door until Elizabeth had to dig it clear just to check the fire. On the second day, Emily asked, "What about the sheep?" Elizabeth had been trying not to think about the sheep. They had food. She'd stocked the cavern with hay. They had shelter. But she couldn't check on them. Couldn't know if they were safe. They're in the cavern, she said. They're protected. But she didn't know. And the not knowing ate at her. On the third day, the snow stopped. The wind kept blowing, sculpting drifts that buried the bridge, the wood pile, half the cabin. Elizabeth dug her way out at first light, leaving the girls inside with strict instructions. The valley was transformed, snow 6 feet deep in places, the brook invisible except where dark water showed in gaps. The path to the cavern was erased. Elizabeth waded through drifts that came to her chest, fighting for each step, her breath harsh in the brutal cold. The cavern mouth appeared slowly, dark against white, smoke still rising from where she'd banked the fire before the storm. Elizabeth's heart was pounding, not just from exertion, but from fear of what she'd find. She climbed over the last drift and into the cavern. All 16 sheep were alive. They clustered at the back, warm from their own body heat and the banked coals of the fire Elizabeth had maintained. The hay racks were still half full. The pen had held. The cavern's steady temperature and solid roof had done exactly what Elizabeth had counted on. She stood there, snow melting off her coat, and felt something break loose in her chest. Relief so intense it was almost painful. While neighbors had likely lost animals to the cold, her careful preparation had paid off. The thing everyone mocked, the cavern itself had proven its worth. "You're all right," she whispered to the sheep. "You're all right." The brown ewe, the first one to lamb, came and nosed her hand as if to say, "Of course we are. This is what you built for." Elizabeth checked every animal, examining hooves and bodies for cold damage, redistributing hay, breaking ice on their water. She built up the fire, added more hay to the racks, and made sure each sheep seemed healthy and calm. When she was satisfied they'd weathered the storm better than she dared hope, she started back to the cabin and found a man standing by her bridge. Edward Mills. She recognized him from the village. Heavy-set, prosperous, with a face that expected deference. "Mrs. Thompson," he said. "Quite a storm." It was, Elizabeth said carefully, aware that she was alone with him, that the cabin was 30 yards away with her daughters inside. "I came to see the operation everyone's talking about. Your water wheel, your cavern barn." He looked around as if evaluating a poor investment. "Impressive that you've survived this long. I plan to do more than survive. That's what I wanted to discuss." His voice was pleasant, but his eyes were cold. "You've been undercutting the mill's prices, taking business that should rightfully go to established operations. I charge fair prices for good work. You charge desperate prices because you're desperate. It's not sustainable, Mrs. Thompson, and it sets a bad precedent." Elizabeth's hands were freezing, but she kept her voice steady. "Is there a point to this conversation, Mr. Mills? I'm offering to buy you out. A fair price, probably more than you paid. You can move back to the village, find proper work, raise your daughters somewhere they'll have a future. My daughters have a future here. Do they?" He gestured at the snow-buried valley. "Look at this place. You're one bad winter, one broken wheel, one sick child away from disaster. I'm offering you a way out." "I don't want a way out." His expression hardened. "You're being foolish, and foolish people get hurt." "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact. Accidents happen. Equipment breaks. People who don't belong somewhere eventually figure that out." Elizabeth met his eyes. She was cold, exhausted, and frightened. But she was also the woman who'd built a cabin, delivered lambs, and made a water wheel work with her own hands. "I belong here," she said. "This is my land, my operation, and my choice. If that's all, Mr. Mills, I have daughters waiting." She walked past him to the cabin, feeling his eyes on her back, refusing to hurry or show fear. She didn't relax until the door was closed and barred behind her. Emily looked up from where she was entertaining Sophie. Who was that? No one important, Elizabeth lied. But that night, she didn't sleep. She planned instead. How to protect the wheel, how to watch for sabotage, how to prove her operation was not just surviving, but succeeding. Spring came with a rush of melt water and sudden warmth. The snow retreated, revealing a valley scraped clean and ready for renewal. Elizabeth's sheep had made it through. All 16 adults, and the ewes were pregnant again. But more importantly, word had spread about the blizzard. People had heard that Elizabeth's livestock had survived when others in the valley had lost animals to the cold. They'd heard about her cavern barn, how the temperature had stayed stable, how her preparation and unconventional thinking had paid off. A few, not many, but a few, began to reconsider their dismissal of her methods. Some admitted quietly that maybe the widow knew what she was doing after all. Robert Hayes brought grain every 2 weeks. Now his wife bought yarn regularly. 2 other farmers tried Elizabeth's milling service and were satisfied enough to return then to recommend her to others. It wasn't acceptance exactly, but it was acknowledgement. And that was a start. The real change came in late May when the Fletcher family, her nearest neighbors, lost their barn to a spring fire. Lightning strike, nothing they could have prevented. But it left them with livestock and nowhere to shelter them. Richard Fletcher appeared at Elizabeth's property on a gray morning, hat in his hands, the pride clearly costing him. "Mrs. Thompson, I know we haven't been neighborly, but I'm in a situation. I've got nowhere to keep my stock until I can rebuild." Elizabeth waited, letting the moment stretch. This was what she'd both wanted and dreaded, the chance to repay cold treatment with grace or cruelty. She looked at Richard Fletcher, proud, uncomfortable, desperate, and thought about what kind of person she wanted to be, what kind of example she wanted to set for her daughters watching from the cabin door. "I have space," she said. "Back section of the cavern, past the sheep pen. I'll need help building a partition, and you'll have to manage your own feeding. Rate is $2 per month per head. That's more than fair." "Thank you." "And Mr. Fletcher?" She waited until he met her eyes. "When your barn is rebuilt and your cattle go home, I'd appreciate it if you remembered that the cavern everyone mocked kept your stock safe." His face reddened, but he nodded. "I'll remember." Word of that exchange spread faster than any gossip about her supposed failures. By July, 3 more families had asked about renting cavern space for storage. Hay, equipment, seed grain that needed to stay dry and cool. Elizabeth charged modest rates and made more in 2 months than she'd made all previous year. The water wheel kept turning. The sheep kept thriving. And slowly, grudgingly, the community's relationship with Elizabeth Thompson began to change. Edward Mills never apologized. He never acknowledged his veiled threats. But when his mill's water source ran low during a dry September and he needed to divert flow temporarily, he came to Elizabeth to negotiate access to the brook. She agreed to a fair arrangement and charged him market rates for the privilege. By the time winter came again, the property had a name in local conversation, the Cavern Homestead. Not as an insult anymore, but as a description, the place where that widow had made the impossible work. 3 years after Elizabeth bought the land, she stood outside the cabin on a November evening and took inventory of what she'd built from nothing. The cabin had a real window now, glass she'd saved for and installed herself, replacing the oiled paper that had barely survived 2 winters. The bridge was reinforced with additional supports. The water wheel ran smooth and reliable, its rhythm as constant as breathing, servicing a dozen regular customers who now trusted her work. Her flock had grown to 25 sheep, producing enough wool to supply 2 weavers in the village and interest from a merchant in the county seat. Emily, 12 now, could card and spin as well as her mother. She'd also taught herself to keep accounts, tracking income and expenses in a ledger with careful precision, her neat columns showing steady profit. Sophie, 5, helped feed the sheep and could recite each one's name and personality, treating them like extended family members. They weren't rich. They'd never be rich, but they had food, heat, security, and something Elizabeth valued more than wealth: autonomy, independence, the freedom to live by their own labor and decisions. The cavern rose behind the cabin, its dark mouth exhaling warmth into the cold air. Inside, the sheep were bedding down for the night, safe and fed, their contentment audible even from here. The water wheel's distant splash was a constant rhythm, proof of work done and work continuing, a sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. Elizabeth had learned something in these 3 years. The thing everyone calls worthless might only be waiting for someone to see it differently. The cavern that made the land unusable was the reason the land worked at all. Mama. Emily appeared beside her carrying firewood. Mrs. Collins wants to know if we can supply 20 more skeins by next month. We can, said Elizabeth. We'll need to card extra this week. I can help. I know you can. They stood together in the gathering dark, smoke rising from the chimney, lamplight glowing yellow through the glass window. From the cavern, a sheep bleated softly, and another answered. Elizabeth had bought this land because it was all she could afford. She'd made it work because she had no other choice. But somewhere in the building, and the planning and the stubborn refusal to fail, it had become more than survival. It had become home. She put her arm around Emily's shoulders, and together they walked inside, leaving the cold and the dark behind. Tomorrow would bring more work. There was always more work, but tonight there was warmth, family, and the quiet satisfaction of a day ended well. The cavern stood watch behind them. No longer a curse, but a shelter. No longer worthless, but priceless. And Elizabeth Thompson, who'd been called foolish and desperate and wrong, had proven the only thing that mattered, that she knew exactly what she was doing all along.